Hi everyone and welcome back. Welcome to my microservices tutorial. So in the first video we talked about the agenda and what all we are going to cover. And in the second video I talked about, so let's say first video is all about slides where I talked about what we are going to do. In the second video we created a simple repo baseline, dependencies and package script and all these things, what you need to create a baseline template. Okay, now we have all the utilities, plugins, extensions, everything. Now we need to patch the framework in the code, because we are talking about microservices in the Node.js, so we will be sticking to the Node.js framework. That can be NestJS and Express. Now, but here the important aspect is, because we are going to work on the microservices and I'm not the person where I just create a repository for the front and back end, for utilities, for the infra separately. No, we are going to use either a monorepo or a single repo, right? So there is a next thing you need to understand is single repo or monorepo. Because the important part is we are living in 2023 and 2024 is coming up. We cannot just create a single repository and where, okay, this is for just this microservice. Then there is another repository for another microservice. So let's say if you are building a product, then you might end up having 10 to 20 different repositories for maintaining a separate services. Let's say if you don't have a big team and your team is very much familiar with working in monorepo environment where you can do the code collaborations on different services, then it's easy to work with monorepo. Single repo is like, okay, one microservice will use a single monorepo, right? Single repo. Let's say I created a user service that will have its own dependencies, utilities and all. It will use a baseline code which we have done. Then there is, let's say, payment service. It will have its own database, its own code, its own Lambda. So what I wanted to avoid is having these different repositories, totally different. I mean, they will obviously be independent services in their own domain or a folder namespace, but I want to have a single repository. So there comes an important concept of a single repo or monorepo, right? All these things will go inside a one single code base. It will be added as a one single repo. And there are different advantages of doing such things. We can use these NX based monorepo or Lana based monorepo and all. I mean, there are many providers which will help you to set up your monorepo. For the beginners, you can start with a single repository, and I will also start with a single repository for some videos. And then when we are done with creating a first microservice, then we will jump to a monorepo, and then we will use a NX monorepo, NX tooling, and we are going to use a package based monorepo with PNPM workspace. So that we will try to understand and we'll try to put these things in our head so we can use just only one repository with all the services, all the infra, all the utilities, all the front end, server side, client side, all the code can be there in a single repository monorepo. And there are different monorepo solutions. Currently single repo. So we already created a baseline, right? Now in this baseline we need to patch in either NestJS or Express TypeScript, because now I'm not going to write Express JavaScript code, and you should also not be doing it. If you are doing it, stop doing that. So always use NestJS. It's already supports TypeScript. We will be using NestJS TypeScript and Express TypeScript. So we can use this for baselining our first repository or first service. So I'm going to do it in the two different ways. First, I will create a baseline for the Express app. So we'll use Express TypeScript. And I'm going to build an APIs which follows 12 factor principles. That means managing the configurations, managing the database connections, total isolations in the environment, decoupling, 12-factor principles you can Google out. These are the principles which each and every microservices should follow. So it's not only about building an APIs in the NestJS and Express TypeScript, but also following those fundamental principles before writing our first microservice and then deploying it to some AWS environment as a Lambda, or on AWS ECS as a container running 24/7. Okay, so before that I have just a small content about what all we are covering, what are the major areas. This is a module 1 which talks about baselining and getting ready for using single repo structure for the microservices. Then we will talk more about the different concepts of architectures and deployments, microservices provided by NestJS and Express TypeScript using event-driven architecture or serverless architectures and all. I'm going to divide this whole playlist into 3 segments, and this is going to be really interesting because I'm going to put all my efforts in building it with all the different aspects of any microservice development. But the technology stack will be stick to Node.js only. I mean, you can build microservices in either Spring Boot, Java, using Python, using Golang, or using Node.js. So here we are dividing it into 3 different verticals, you can say, and 3 different verticals will be okay. The first vertical will be the choosing the framework, because whenever we actually build an application, we always look for how to build the APIs, how to build the platform, right? And here we are talking about services, how to build these services. So we always choose a framework and the language. So language, we are still stick to JS stack, JavaScript world only. And here we can just think about, okay, we are using Node.js, server-side JavaScript, and on top of that the framework. So the framework we can stick to Express and NestJS because I really love that. After working on NestJS, I don't explore any other framework to build the API platform. So what is the overall agenda? First of all, we choose the framework, we choose the design, we choose the how we are going to build it, and then next thing we are going to do is how we are going to deploy, right? So this is all about choosing the framework, choosing the language, and also let's talk about the coding and the best practices, right? So it's all about coding standards and structures. Because what happens is that whatever you build, either you build Express, which is unopinionated framework, or NestJS, you need to have proper structure, you need to have a proper baseline of things, whatever you are going to put in the microservice, so that you can have a clean separation of whatever you are building. So you just need to introduce all the 12-factor principles in your application. 12-factor app principles, if you might have heard about this, we need to introduce all these into our independent microservice. It should be adopting a loose coupling. You should have a isolation and separations of all the environment variables which you are using. You should have a clear logging process. You should have a proper process of logging, proper process of injecting the environment variables into your process. You should have a graceful shutdown of your application. You should be logging all the critical aspects of your applications and how you should interact with the database. I mean, we need to work on how to build a best out of a microservice, right? So we need to adopt all these 12-factor app principles. There are 12 factors. I will just name it and we'll talk about it. So it's all about the coding practices, how to structure a simple Express app, NestJS app, or any other framework, and then how to deal with the if we talk about NestJS, there are like lots of things come into the picture. How to deal with asynchronous things in your code, how to deal with the logging, how to deal with the database connections, how to aggregate the queries, and all those aspects will come into your coding practices. Because currently you can build an Express application, but when it comes to build the best out of it, there is always, there is nothing best. If I'm building something, then there is someone else can build far more best than that, right? It's all about coding practices and what best you can build, because there is always someone who can build the same thing in some different way, which looks nicer and which looks more understandable. Okay, the last thing which we are going to adopt in this microservice section is the deployment part, because that is always important. Either you use server based services which you are deploying on machines, or you are using a Lambda based approach which you are deploying on Lambdas, right? Because that is purely serverless. And here we are going to also talk about the architecture patterns. I have covered those architecture patterns in my previous videos also, but I will just talk more focus on serverless and maybe a server based, and I will not go much into deep of this CQRS event driven and all. We can talk about some of the examples of CQRS and sourcing and event driven approach, event driven architecture, which we cover in the serverless world. Okay, these are some of the most popular architecture patterns we are going to explore. And then it comes to the deployment. In the deployment, we are going to use some standard toolings, because recently, if you look into my channel, I covered AWS CDK. So we will see how we can do the deployment of individual services in Lambda. Or so let's say you are building an Express application. How you can deploy that Express application on Heroku or each instance, because you need a server running to run the application. Or if you are running a simple Node.js service, then how you can deploy that as a Lambda in the serverless, right? So it's going to be lots of fun, I think, because here I'm going to combine everything about microservices. And if you talk about NestJS, then I already covered NestJS microservices. It's NestJS microservices. Because when it comes to microservices, people think like, okay, in the NextJS microservice, I already covered all the different patterns which you can adopt. So NextJS microservices we have already covered. What is a NextJS microservices? We have seen, okay, how to create a tiny microservices which are using TCP, which is using gRPC, which is using these asynchronous communication using RabbitMQ or Kafka or Redis based, because these all are transport medium, right? NextJS microservice provide extensive framework, extensive libraries, NextJS microservices, which will allow you to create a standalone services which allow you to communicate using TCP, gRPC, using AMQP protocol, and using Redis, publish subscriber. Or you can create asynchronous microservices which will listen to the particular event. You remember, if we do the same thing in Express, you need to spend more effort, you need to put more effort. But same thing when we write in NestJS, it is very simplified. So this is really important, and we will talk about in depth, and I will include my existing videos also, which I have already built in the NestJS microservices. So it's going to be fun. So we will start with Express, move to the NestJS microservices, deployment of these services as a Lambda, deployment these services as an instance running 24/7 on the containers. And then with this also, we will also talk about containerization. So deployment and containerization is kind of a same. Containerization using Docker. When you talk about Docker is all about, now these days we just use a Docker to spin up the container and deploy application. There are some platforms which are still using Docker, like Heroku. Heroku allows you to create a Docker container to run your Node.js application. And we will also use Kubernetes. I don't have any videos on Kubernetes, like how to work with it when you are building a simple Node.js application. So we will cover that, because these days learning these things should be easy, and you should know each and everything. So all the tools and technologies, Express, NestJS microservices, 12-factor principles, AWS CDK, maybe Terraforms, Heroku, Lambda, serverless, deploying these Express app and NestJS app as a Lambda, containerization, Docker container, Docker Compose, Kubernetes, architecture patterns, okay, serverless or server based, and all these core and very popular architecture patterns like CQRS, event sourcing, event driven architecture pattern, and how we will see how we can create a loosely coupled services which are totally independent, which have their own data source and own API sets. And when you are talking about any system, because what we are building a service. Service can expose any kind of interface. We have seen that in the NestJS. NestJS microservices allows you to talk using TCP interface, gRPC interface, AMQP and Redis as a transport. Similarly, you can use a different interface for building a service. You can expose a REST interface, HTTP transport mode. You can use a GraphQL interface. You can use TRPC or gRPC, right? So these are like different interface you can expose through the service. So all those things is possible by either using Express, by using NestJS. I mean, TRPC is just like a simple library that is more compatible with Express, but we can explore if we want to do it with the NestJS also. Okay, so this is pretty much this is the core we are going to talk about, right? And this is really nice because we are going to talk about these modules one by one. And what are these modules? Let me just give an overview what all these modules, because these are like independent sections we are covering and they can independently be discussed, okay, but they will be part of a single playlist. So if you are already building the APIs, then this is the right way of doing it. Express, I won't be talking about how to build APIs with Express, but let's build a simple API, simple implementation using Express by using all the different tools and technologies. Using best practices, we will baseline an application. Similarly with the NestJS, and then we will introduce a 12-factor principles and build a core baseline template for building any kind of service. Then we will talk about how we can think about the coding practices and all. Then different architecture pattern to build a microservices, like I want to build a simple service as a microservice and deploy as a Lambda. I want to build a simple authentication service and deploy that on a server EC2. I want to build a microservices which is listening to the asynchronous events coming from Kafka, RabbitMQ, Redis, right? So microservices can be exposing interface, asynchronous interface using REST, GraphQL or gRPC, or asynchronous interface which is listening to these asynchronous events coming from these messaging queues. And then deployment part, that should be easy because we know how to deploy Lambda how to deploy a simple Express app as a Lambda or NestJS app as a Lambda. And then containerization, we'll discuss Docker Compose for the local containerization and Kubernetes, that is totally new to us. So that's pretty much I'm going to talk about, and it's going to be really fun doing all these things together. With this, I'm already covering NestJS Advanced, but that is primarily talking about NestJS stuff. Okay, let's see you in the next video, guys.